Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Huerta. I'm from the USAID-funded Global Health Supply Chain Program in South Africa, and we're going to be talking to you today about direct delivery and the experiences within the Gauteng province around direct delivery. So what we'll do is we'll just go through a little bit of a background to explain to you how the distribution of medicines works in South Africa, some of the challenges that we experienced and the reasons for looking at direct delivery as an alternative, some of the advantages and disadvantages of the direct delivery process, and then what are the challenges and how do we propose to mitigate those challenges. And then finally, just having a look at the gains that have been made by the department by using direct delivery as an alternative means of distribution within the province. And that isn't it. Okay. So this is a map of South Africa. Within South Africa, we have 9 provinces. We are all based in Gauteng at the moment, which is the smallest of the provinces. And at this, the traditional distribution mechanism was that we have 10 depots. So each province has 1, with 2 in the Eastern Cape province. And those depots are being supplied by the manufacturers. Now, as Gavin mentioned earlier, 95% of those manufacturers are based in Gauteng. So most of those suppliers will be supplying the depots from Gauteng itself. Some are based in Cape Town, some are based in the Eastern Cape, but traditionally 95% of the distribution to those depots comes from Gauteng. From there, it's the responsibility of the depot then to on-deliver to the healthcare facilities. So this is the traditional model. But we've had a number of challenges with it. So if you have a look around the bottom, this is what the supply chain traditionally looked like. And in not all instances does it have all the steps, but this is probably worst case scenario. So you'll have a supplier which then either uses or doesn't use a distributor. They then deliver to the provincial warehouse, or what we refer to as a depot. Sometimes that then gets distributed onto a sub-depot or sub-warehouse. From there it moves to the hospital, and from the hospital it finally gets to the clinic. So it's quite a long and convoluted supply chain, and obviously, as we know, every time that you increase the length of the supply chain, you increase the safety stock that's kept at every point, and as a result you increase the amount of capital that is tied up in stock. The problem is we've got a very long lead time, so if there has been a stock out of a product, it's got to start filtering all the way down, and everybody holds on to their piece of the safety stock before it eventually gets down to the clinic, and sometimes it actually never realizes to get to the clinic. Poor payment of suppliers has been one of the other challenges. The multiple tiers, as I've indicated, increases not only the length of the supply chain, but the amount of risk within it. The lack of visibility to lower tiers. Every time you add a tier, you almost have a break in the supply chain. So from this provincial depot down to the clinic, they didn't have that. And some of the other sessions are presenting on how that was overcome. Aging infrastructure. A number of these warehouses were built back in the 60 years ago. You can imagine that 60 years ago, the population of this country was very different. And given our apartheid history, it was also built to service a very different portion of the population to what it is required to service now. Plus, we didn't have the disease burden that we have today, looking at HIV and AIDS and the related TB, plus all the other, the quadruple burden of disease that we have. So clearly that infrastructure wasn't sufficient to cope with it. As a result, outdated and inappropriate processes and systems. And if you have a look at the IT system that manages 6 out of the 10 depots at the moment, it was developed back in the 80s and is still being used today. So you can imagine it's not probably the best system either. Inability to scale the warehousing and distribution. So when you have an increase in your disease burden, or if you have particular campaigns, you are stuck with static warehousing that you are unable to scale appropriately. So those were some of the challenges that the traditional system was faced with. So what we looked at is trying to find a better system, a system that could be scalable. And what we looked at is the direct delivery model, whereby a supplier, either from themselves or through their distributor, will deliver directly to the hospital, and in some cases, depending on volume and the size of the clinic, can deliver directly to the clinic. So what this means is that you have a reduced storage and distribution requirements. That is the burden on the province or the government, so they're not required to provide that anymore. You have reduced inventory and wastage because you've shortened your supply chain, and also your depot's not keeping 3 months worth of stock. and you're leveraging on the existing private sector, which has the infrastructure, the capacity, and the resources to service this market. Now, this may be unique to South Africa in that we have a really mature and sophisticated private sector supply chain for pharmaceuticals, so it might not be appropriate in other African countries, but it was definitely something that was an opportunity for South Africa to make use of. So the direct delivery model was designed with the end of increasing availability at the healthcare facilities, reducing the length of the supply chain and the associated risk, reducing stock holding at the provincial depot, and decongesting the provincial warehouse in order for the existing capacity to cope with the demand. So they have a set amount of capacity. If we reduce the amount of work moving through there, they are more geared to be able to service the rest of their demanders or customers. So the advantages of the direct delivery is it's definitely shifted that risk to suppliers. So the risk of stock holding, the risk of distribution, and the risk of expired stock has been effectively shifted to the supplier. So it's reduced wastage and reduced the overall cost to serve. So the cost to serve with the supplier doing it, we've reduced that storage and distribution costs from the government. It's reduced the operational costs of the provincial warehouse and reduce the stock holding and increase the capacity to service all demanders equally within the provincial warehouse. But obviously, with all things, there are disadvantages that come a lot with it. And some of these were not explicit at the time of the design of this model and only became apparent as time went by. So what we found is that there's been an increased number of deliveries to health facilities. Under the traditional model, they would get once a week delivery from the depot. Now you have suppliers arriving at their back door, multiple suppliers, and there are 120 within the supply chain who are contracted, arriving at the back door. So that led to some of the challenges. There's a potential for suppliers to increase their prices because they were used to supplying bulk to a single point. Now they're supplying smaller quantities to multiple distribution points. Difficult to procure outside of the contract in the case of a stock out. Now traditionally, if there has been a stock out and you have to go and procure, you procure a large quantity that gets stored at the depot. Now what you have is multiple facilities that have placed orders, and in order to do a buyout against a contracted supplier, you need to do it against those invoices or orders that have already been created. So that created a big problem for the department, as well as the consequence of suppliers now increasing their minimum order quantities. So they had two ways of combating this, to combating the potential price increase on their side. Either increase the cost of the medicine that you're procuring, or alternatively, leave the price the same, but increase the minimum order quantity. So, for example, and Dumisani used this in the last presentation, you have a supplier in Cape Town that has to deliver one unit costing 4 Rand to Gauteng. It doesn't make sense economically for them. So they started introducing higher minimum order quantities. So the challenges and some of the proposed solutions around the minimum order quantities. The challenges increased minimum order quantities that are not suitable for all facilities. So to say that for an oncology product you have to order 1,000 units at a particular facility doesn't make sense for all facilities to do that. Increased expenditure on medicines because of their high minimum order quantities, and as a result increased either overstock and potential wastage, and also compliance issues. So the system that generates the orders is pre-programmed to comply with the minimum order quantities. So you will have a facility that places an order for 100, and all of a sudden they receive 400. The order requisition, if the auditor has to come along, sees 100 and sees that it was supplied with 400. So there's an audit query already. So how do we overcome this? Critical review of the minimum order quantities when it comes to the contracting, but also having a look at segmentation. So coming to the understanding that not all products are ideally suited to direct delivery, and not all facilities are ideally suited to direct delivery. So coming up with a matrix, having a look at the attributes of either facility, of the supplier, or of the product to say, should this be kept in the central depot, or should this go direct delivery, is the other way of looking at it. The potential for increase in price due to the direct delivery process. So suppliers are used to delivering to a single point. So we can introduce the idea of a cross-dock facility. So use the existing infrastructure that has now had reduced capacity and now has a bit more space and rather use that as a cross-stock, requiring suppliers to pick and pack for delivery to the final destination, but enabling them to consolidate and deliver through to a single point. And then also the introduction of nominated delivery dates. So giving a supplier nominated delivery days, so say every Friday, you will deliver all your orders to this particular point. Enables them to consolidate and enables them to reduce their costs of distribution. Having hospitals receiving multiple deliveries, the 2 points above will help to assist to reduce and reduce the number of orders by consolidation, but also making sure that facilities are well capacitated to be able to deal with direct deliveries and multiple orders should they arise. So when it comes to segmenting your distribution, you need to have a look at the attributes of the supplier. Are they reliable? If they're a habitually non-reliable supplier, you don't want to be using them for direct delivery. Having a look at the attributes of the product to say, does this product make sense for direct delivery? And generally what you find is high volume, high value products with highly reliable suppliers fit the model better. And then the last one is delay and reconciliation of documentation. So in the depot model, you're having a delivery to the depot. The unit responsible for paying the supplier resides at the depot. You have your documentation there. Now with direct delivery, what you land up is they're delivering to all these facilities around the province. Now you need to get all that documentation back. And that presents itself with a challenge, which ultimately leads to delay in payment of suppliers, which is not what we're looking for. What Gauteng did to overcome that is they made the responsibility of the collection of that documentation from facilities part of the contract, and the suppliers were required to deliver all those invoices back to the depot. The other alternative is to look at electronic documentation. Gauteng has used and is now using a new portal system whereby suppliers have the ability to submit their documentation electronically so that there's a repository and you can go and draw off the documents that are required to substantiate the payment of the supplier. What are the gains that have been made? You can see that from 2013-14, when this was started in Gauteng province to date, we have seen an increase in medicine availability at facility level moving from 82% to 97%, and the availability at the provincial warehouse moving from 78% to 92%. You will recall in Gavin's presentation earlier, he made mention of the 70% direct delivery. So the minister has basically said that 70% of all products for identified facilities will move through the direct delivery process. So you'll see that this constitutes two different buckets of products, and that's why there's a bit of a difference in the percentages. Yeah. It's a different grouping of medicines, yeah. And then the reduced stock holding. Now, this reduced stock holding does not take into account the annual increases that take place. So this is a non-normalized figure. But in spite of that, we've seen that there's been a 30% reduction in the value of stock being held at the depot, which equates to around about 29 or 30 million rands worth of stock year on year. And that's on the average. So I think you said it was around about 300,000. Sorry? 360 million rand reduction in stock holding. So that's releasing that capital, making the funds available to be used elsewhere. Yep. So sometimes the challenge, but in this place works in our advantage, is the funds made available for pharmaceuticals is not ring-fenced. So it can actually, those funds can be used elsewhere. Yeah. And that's it. Any questions?
I had a question around supply chain. Thank you. Jeff Rowland from Gavi, Vaccine Alliance. Had a question around supply chain design and optimization. So in the direct delivery model, you've got these suppliers going directly to facilities. Who decides on the optimal supply chain design and changes in it? Is it the ministry? Is it the suppliers themselves? With that new model, have you been able to create efficiencies, or it sounds like it's actually gotten much more complex and potentially costly? as you
So when you say optimization and supply chain design, are you talking about segmenting as to which products are going through there?
No, how you're actually running the supply chain. So are you running, so when a supplier goes out to one facility, does that company also decide to do a milk run where they're going to several facilities at once?
Yep.
And
Okay.
do you have those plans and are able to influence the
So
optimization?
generally, that becomes the responsibility of the supplier to optimize their own supply chain. But what you do find is where they are using direct delivery, particularly in Gauteng, is those suppliers are already delivering to a private sector pharmacy right next door to it. So Gauteng is less of an issue, whereas in the more rural provinces that might not necessarily be the case. But what they are able to do is they are able to take advantage of their existing infrastructure and probably get more economies of scale through that. We leave it to them to do that. What we have found is that one of the distributors, Imperial Health Sciences, they have actually started with a cross-docking model for suppliers that are not using them as a distributor to say, bring it to us and we'll then co-load it onto our existing deliveries. Yeah, but it's basically left to them. Sorry, whoever's got the mic.
Is the direct deliveries just in Gauteng? And if not, for the facilities that you can only get to by foot, are those included,
Yep.
those far-flung? And if not, then who does those facilities?
Okay, so I think we've got very few places that are only available by foot in this country. We have a fairly sophisticated supply chain in comparison to others. But when you look at the segmentation, you need to look at the facility as well. So the attributes are, is it a reliable supplier? Is it a facility that is capable of dealing with direct delivery? And if not, what is the alternative? So that would be the depot. So part of that segmentation needs to take into account, is it rural or is it urban? And can we actually effectively reach it by direct delivery? And in some instances, the answer is no. So then we stick to the traditional models.
So you have a mixed model.
Correct. Yeah. So early days when the direct delivery model was being rolled out, and it is now practically in all the provinces in this country in one form or another at different levels of maturity. The intention was to do away with depots entirely. But as life went on, everybody came to the realization that you cannot do away with depots for a number of different reasons. Sometimes you need buffer stock, sometimes the product is not ideal, but sometimes it's really ideal. So vaculitors and drips, nobody wants to keep that in a depot anyway. It just takes up too much space and nobody can accommodate that. So that's an ideal product for direct delivery because of the physical attribute of the product. But there's others that we can just say the facility is in such a position that it's going to really cost too much to be able to deliver it. Or the supplier will turn around and say, that's fine, I'll do direct delivery, but I'm only going to go there once a month. And that's not optimum for us either.
Hi, Krishna Jaffa from the Gates Foundation. Just looking at Gauteng and how you are essentially a central node for the rest of the country, and given the central government is in Pretoria, just wondering whether there is any translation of lessons that you're able to learn by having that bird's eye view to other provinces, and then a follow-up question to that. Is the health system strengthening budget held primarily at the province level, or is it split between federal and province?
Okay, so the budget is held at provincial level. There is a little bit of procurement that takes place for nationally, and that's usually identified priority products that are kept on a national store. But all the provincial budgets are held at the provincial level. When I showed here, let me just go back. This particular picture, it's not coming out of this depot. It's just that all the suppliers are based in Gauteng. Yeah. So the bird's eye view is really from a national level. So national has visibility of what's taking place in all the provinces. So one of the ways we overcame the data constraint that we have is suppliers are required to give us all data related to all orders. So they are contractually bound to give that by the 7th of every month. So that gives visibility to the National Department of Health to see what's happening in all the provinces. Okay. Any other questions?
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
No one answers. So, thank you, Dumisani. So, I guess, I'm just trying to think about, as you roll out something like direct delivery, you probably want some uniformity of action at the province level. And if the the budgets are held by the province. Any lessons learned about when that goes well versus when that becomes an extended negotiation with the province to buy into a new way of doing business?
So it has been a challenge, and some provinces have been desperate to hang on to their depot model. But through political processes, it can actually go through. So it's really a case of presenting at the right forums. So the National Health Council, which is made up of all our health MECs and the HODs, is where these get presented and agreed to. And once it's agreed there, then it becomes the process to follow. But it has been a bit of a challenge, and not all provinces are bought into it. So Gauteng was the second province to go, so they are quite a way along compared to a number of the other provinces. Yeah.
A bit of a follow-up, because I actually understood, it reminded me from before that actually Western Cape gets priority often from the suppliers because they pay on time. So is there any mechanism from the national level to sort of harmonize or to make it a bit more equal between contexts?
So Western Cape actually gets priority for more than just because they pay on time. They rather impose penalties. So the contracts with the suppliers allow you to impose penalties. Not all provinces have been equal in applying that rule. So Gauteng has been good at it, KZN and Western Cape, but not all the other provinces. So that has actually happened where the Western Cape does get priority over it. But it is a case of imposing those penalties equally by all provinces to make sure that everybody actually gets fair treatment. But also the payment of suppliers is critical. So if you do know you're going to get paid, obviously you're going to choose to go through to that province that does do that. So two of the things that we need to make sure are permanently good, because we can only give two things to the supplier. We can only give them good turnaround on payment, and we can only give them more accurate forecasting. And if we can give the suppliers those two things, then it's a win-win situation for everybody. And the increased visibility that the direct delivery has given, together with a number of the other initiatives that we're presenting around the building today, together with the forecasting and hopefully improving the documentation flow, we can give those suppliers what they're looking for. Yeah. Marlene?
Hi, my name is Marlene. I'm from Imperial. So I've heard a reason why the Western Cape doesn't want to become part of this system, and it's the reason I've heard is that they say it works well for them, having their own depot. And earlier you also said that each of the provinces do have DDVs in some shape or form. So that being said, would there still be benefits for Western Cape to go to this model? And that's the first question. And secondly, because the DA that governs the Western Cape has now taken over Gauteng, do you think that if they see the benefit of what it's done for Gauteng, that they would actually consider implementing same in...
Thanks, Marlene.
Pleasure.
Take me down the political route, which I'm going to avoid at all costs.
It's one of the...
So just to be clear, the DA hasn't taken over Gauteng. They've just taken over some of the metros in Gauteng. Yeah. With regards to direct delivery, in spite of what the Western Cape does say, they do make use of direct delivery. In fact, the three central hospitals, Grooterschuur, Tygerberg, and Red Cross Children's Hospital that reside in the Western Cape only work on direct delivery. Plus their CCMDD service provider in the Western Cape also only uses direct delivery. So they are using it in some shape or form. And it's always been around. We've just increased it up to the 70%. So DDV was what we know it to be called as. Direct delivery has always existed, but we're just increasing the volume of it now. Yeah.